Hello YouTube. In this video we're going to look at a new argument against moral realism, the moral underdetermination argument. This comes from Marius Baumann in the paper Moral Underdetermination and a New Skeptical Challenge. Before getting into that, just a quick advert. If you like this channel, you can support me on Patreon or give a one-off donation on PayPal. Also, I offer private tutoring in philosophy. Please email me if you are interested in that. Okay, so Baumann begins with Derek Parfit's triple theory, presented in Parfit's book On What Matters. According to the triple theory, the best versions of Kantianism, consequentialism, and contractualism agree on what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, what is forbidden and permissible. These theories, according to Parfit, or at least the best versions of these theories, make the same prescriptions for action. Parfit uses the analogy that these theories are different ways of climbing the same ethical mountain. Traditionally, of course, we think that there are a variety of alternative moral theories. Kantianism, consequentialism, and contractualism are the three most popular approaches, or some of the most popular approaches in contemporary philosophy. And we usually think that these theories give different verdicts about what we ought to do. For example, the Kantian says we ought never to treat other people as mere means. You know, we ought not to kill one person even to save a greater number of others. The consequentialist, by contrast, says we ought to maximize the good, and as such, she treats everybody as a means of producing whatever counts as the good state. The consequentialist has no objection in principle to killing one person to save others. Finally, contractualism is based on the notion of a social contract. On that approach, what you ought to do is determined by what rules everybody would agree to under certain ideal conditions. So it seems pretty clear that these are alternative moral theories. Now, Parfit's arguments here are detailed, but the basic idea can be stated quite straightforwardly. So what Parfit says is, well, Kantianism tells us that the moral principles, the correct moral principles, are those that everybody can rationally will. But then Parfit says that these principles will just be the same as those that, if accepted by all, make things go best, which is basically just rule consequentialism. So Kantianism implies rule consequentialism. Moreover, these will be the same principles that nobody can reasonably reject. That is, these will be the principles that everybody would agree to follow, assuming they had full information and were treating each other impartially, and so on. So Kantians, consequentialists, and contractualists will adopt the same moral rules. They will converge on the same moral rules. What seemed to be radically different moral theories actually converge in their prescriptions for action. And, you know, we might suggest as well that, I mean, this is kind of what has been seen in practice in the development of recent moral philosophy. As the debate between Kantians, consequentialists, and contractualists has proceeded, with each side making various concessions to the others in response to objections, the more sophisticated versions of these theories have begun to converge. So Parfit says that there isn't, in practice, well, and in fact in principle, there isn't really a substantial disagreement between the best available moral theories. Far from it, they're all converging on the same principles for action. Now, Parfit takes the triple theory to lend support to moral realism. So, in particular, if our best moral theories converge, this undermines arguments from moral disagreement. Anti-realists will sometimes try to use moral disagreement to challenge realism, and I will link to my video on moral disagreement in the comments. But if Parfit is right, there is actually very little moral disagreement, at least among well-informed and reasonable people. Moreover, there is moral progress. You know, these three theories are sort of moving towards, you know, they're kind of moving in the same direction, climbing the same mountain. So, so Parfit takes it that this is actually a point in favour of realism, but Baumann says that this kind of view is actually illustrative of a problem for moral realism. And to see why this might be illustrative of a problem, we need to distinguish between two aspects of a moral theory. So what exactly does a moral theory tell us? Well, I mean, there are broadly speaking two components. So First of all, a moral theory will give us a set of deontic verdicts. It tells us, in any given case, how we ought to act. When faced with the trolley problem, the moral theory may say that you ought to pull the lever. You ought to kill one person to save five. Second, a moral theory will give us the reasons behind those deontic verdicts. It will tell us why particular actions are right or wrong. So if it tells you that you ought to pull the lever in the trolley problem, it will give you an explanation about why pulling the lever is the right thing to do. Now, the thing to notice is that even if Kantians, consequentialists, and contractualists can agree on the deontic verdicts, they will disagree about what makes particular actions right or wrong. They make very different claims here. For Kantians, some action X is right because the maxim for that action can rationally be willed to be a universal law. Kantians will appeal to notions like autonomy, intention, goodness of will, and so on. For consequentialists, X is right because it brings about the best consequences. Consequentialists will appeal to notions like outcomes, utility, ranking of goodness, and so on. For contractualists, an action is right because it follows a rule that is part of a hypothetical social contract. Contractualists appeal to notions like hypothetical agreement among idealized agents, cooperation, things like that. So we see that moral theories do not merely list the right and wrong actions, they also provide explanations of what makes actions right or wrong. And the explanations available are radically different, even if the deontic verdicts are the same. So with this in mind, we can state the underdetermination argument. Underdetermination arguments are famous in philosophy of science. So in this context, the problem is that is underdetermination of scientific theory by empirical data. For any set of empirical data, for any set of evidence, there are multiple scientific theories that accommodate that evidence. There are empirically equivalent alternative theories. So, more than one theory can account for the same empirical evidence. Of course, in many cases, we haven't yet articulated empirically equivalent alternative theories, but in principle, such theories could be found. Now, underdetermination is one of the most popular challenges to scientific realism. Scientific realists say that we're justified in taking our best scientific theories to be true, but we judge theories against the empirical evidence. How do we decide which scientific theory to accept? Well, we draw predictions from the theory, then we make observations to test whether those predictions are true. So if there are alternative theories that entail the same predictions, that undermines our confidence in any given theory. Again, I have a video on underdetermination in science. I will again link that in the comments if you're interested in more on this. But hopefully you can see how that works in the scientific case. Now, bearing in mind the distinction between the two aspects of a moral theory, so the deontic verdicts and the reasons for those verdicts, we can see that there is underdetermination of moral theory by deontic content. So for any set of moral theories, for any set of moral verdicts, for any set of deontic verdicts about what you ought to do and ought not to do, verdicts about what is right and wrong, there will be multiple moral theories that accommodate those verdicts. There are deontically equivalent alternative theories. Baumann puts the underdetermination argument like this. Premise 1, there are deontically equivalent rivals to our best moral theories. So there are rival theories that make the same deontic verdicts. Premise 2, some of these deontically equivalent rivals are equally believable as the original theories. Premise 3, when faced with two equally believable theories, belief in either theory should be withheld. Conclusion, belief in even our best moral theories should be withheld. So premise 1 here is, I think, probably uncontroversial. I mean, Parfit's triple theory is illustrative, right? So if Parfit is correct, then there are versions of Kantianism, consequentialism, and contractualism that all deliver the same deontic verdicts, but the reasons for these verdicts differ radically. It's important to note, though, that Parfit's triple theory is only an illustration. Even if we reject Parfit's claim that Kantianism, consequentialism, and contractualism converge, it's just really a matter of logical principle that there will be multiple theories that can deliver the same deontic verdicts. And the reason is just that for any set of data, whether the data be empirical observations or deontic verdicts, there are multiple kind of explanations you can give that are compatible with that data. Okay, so So that's the underdetermination argument against moral realism. Let's turn to some objections. So an obvious place to start is with premise 2, which says that some of these deontically equivalent rivals are equally believable as the original theories. Why should we accept this? Well, one of the reasons why underdetermination is such a powerful challenge in philosophy of science is that empirical observation plays a central role in judging theories. When there is a conflict between two theories, we often think that the gold standard of evidence is to devise some experiment that can decide between them. So if theory T1 predicts that we will observe A, and theory T2 predicts that we will observe not A, and then we observe A, well, that gives us reason to adopt theory T1. Empirical evidence is the primary tool that we use to judge scientific theories, and that's why it's a problem if two theories entail the same empirical evidence. So, underdetermination of scientific theory by empirical data is troubling because the empirical data is what we use to test different theories. That's why empirically equivalent rivals might be equally believable. Now, the trouble for the moral underdetermination argument is that it's not obvious that moral theories work in the same way. So Baumann has pointed out that there is underdetermination of moral theory by deontic verdicts. There are various moral theories that entail the same deontic verdicts. But do we judge moral theories by their deontic verdicts? Well, let's say that, theory T1 tells us to pull the lever in the trolley case and theory T2 tells us not to pull the lever. We might think of these deontic verdicts as being kind of predictions, as it were, of the respective theories. But then how do we determine which prediction is right? How do we determine whether we ought to pull or not to pull the lever? Again, in the scientific case, it's very straightforward to determine which prediction is right. You just make a perceptual observation. How do you determine which prediction is right in the moral case? Well, there is one popular answer here, which is we use our moral intuitions. Moral intuitions can be thought of as our pre-theoretical moral judgments. Even before engaging in moral inquiry, various things will just strike you as right or wrong. Intuitively, it is wrong to torture children, for instance. Now, it's fairly common to say that just as the empirical predictions of scientific theories must correspond to perceptual observations, so the deontic verdicts of moral theories must correspond to moral intuitions. If a moral theory tells us that we ought to torture children, well, that theory should be rejected, right? Like something has gone wrong in that theory because clearly we ought not to torture children. Clearly torturing children is bad. So if a moral theory tells us that, torturing children is good, well, that is highly counterintuitive and that gives us reason to reject the theory. So on this approach, if you have the intuition that you ought to pull the lever in the trolley case, well, that would give you reason to think that T1 makes the right prediction. But with this in mind, there is a fairly serious problem for premise 2 of the underdetermination argument. Because we don't just have intuitions about what is right and wrong, we also have intuitions about why particular things are right and wrong. Consider again the moral judgment that you ought not to torture children. Well, we can ask, why is it the case that you ought not to torture children? And, you can think about some possible answers here. Imagine if somebody said, well, you ought not to torture children because it is illegal to torture children. Or you ought not to torture children because people in my culture disapprove of torturing children. I think many of us would find these claims just sort of prima facie absurd. Those sorts of answers just seem to completely miss the point. There's a difference between morality and law. There's a difference between morality and whatever the social conventions happen to be. The fact that it's illegal to torture children, maybe that gives you some prudential reason not to do so, but it's completely irrelevant as far as as far as morality is concerned. So here's the problem then. We judge moral theories against our moral intuitions, but we have moral intuitions about why particular actions are right and wrong. So in that case, it seems like we could use our moral intuitions to break the tie between deontically equivalent moral theories. Because these deontically equivalent theories will give different explanations about why particular actions are right or wrong. And we have intuitions not just about what is right or wrong, but also about what makes particular things right or wrong. Now, this actually suggests a broader problem with premise 2, which is that, you know, so we don't just judge theories by deontic verdicts. We don't just judge moral theories by their deontic verdicts. There are various other means we can use to assess moral theories. In particular, we might say that theories can differ with respect to certain theoretical virtues, virtues like simplicity, say. We prefer simpler theories. And I mean, in philosophy of science, it's fairly common for scientific realists to say that theoretical virtues can break the tie between empirically equivalent theories. You know, if two theories make the same predictions, but one theory is simpler than the other, then we should believe the simpler theory. Similarly, then, maybe these sorts of virtues can break the tie between deontically equivalent theories. If two theories make the same deontic verdicts, but one of these theories is simpler, well, we have reason to prefer the simpler theory. So, what might the underdetermination argument, what can be said for the underdetermination argument against this sort of objection? Well, we may argue that intuitions and theoretical virtues are not going to be able to break the tie between all deontically equivalent theories. One problem here is that there are different theoretical virtues that pull in different directions. We've already seen two rules of thumb that guide us in constructing a moral theory. So we want the moral theory to accommodate the broadest class of our moral intuitions, and we also want the theory to be simple. But it may be that accommodating intuitions requires introducing complications into the theory. So suppose that T1 and T2 are deontically equivalent theories. T1 is simpler, but T2 has fewer counterintuitive implications. Which theory do we select? Well, it's not obvious. It's not obvious how to weigh these different considerations against each other. Second, even if we just focus on one of these factors, it may not tell decisively in favour of either theory. So let's take accommodation of intuitions. Well, most philosophers would probably say that there are strong intuitions favouring each of Kantianism, consequentialism, and contractualism, and similarly there are strong intuitions that tell against all of these theories. So it's just not at all obvious which of these theories is the most intuitive overall, which of these theories accommodates the most of our intuitions. I mean, and with respect to this, again, you know, the defender of the underdetermination argument can appeal to work like Parfit's. I mean, Parfit's point with his triple theory is that these three theories, Kantianism, consequentialism, and contractualism, these are all equally plausible. You know, if there were decisive problems with any particular theory, then he would never have been motivated to propose the triple theory in the first place. Like if consequentialism were just clearly implausible for some reason, then it really wouldn't matter whether or not it was deontically equivalent to Kantian. You know, we could just ignore it, right? Like the whole reason for developing something like the triple theory is because there's just no consensus on either of these three. Philosophers seem to be split, maybe not exactly evenly, but like there are very smart people who defend each of them. You know, there doesn't seem to be any decisive consideration one way or the other. So, you know, in fact, we have independent reason to think that some of these deontically equivalent theories are equally believable. So that might be one response, although it's worth noting that at this point, we might wonder what work underdetermination is doing. Because if this response is right, then what makes these theories equally believable is simply that we can't decide between them on the basis of things like moral intuitions and theoretical virtues. The fact that the theories are deontically equivalent doesn't seem to be playing any relevant role here. I mean, suppose that T1 and T2 are not deontically equivalent, so T1 and T2 give us different prescriptions for action. But now suppose, as before, that T1 is simpler, while T2 has fewer counterintuitive implications. Well, which theory do we select? That seems like we face just as much of a difficulty in this case as we did in the case where T1 and T2 are deontically equivalent. I mean, basically, the trouble here is that what makes these theories equally believable has nothing to do with whether or not they're deontically equivalent. But then, I mean, it's just not clear why deontic equivalence is, you know, relevant to the argument. We can just talk directly about how, for instance, intuition and simplicity pull us in different directions with no clear way to decide between the two. So it isn't. So, you know, I mean, if the defender of the underdetermination argument was to take the response that's suggested, then it becomes unclear what work underdetermination is actually doing in the argument. Okay, let's consider some further objections. Premise 3 says that if two theories are equally believable, belief in them should be withheld. But why? Well, presumably the thought here is that when two theories are equally believable, no convincing case can be made for one over the other. And I mean, there are some pretty, sort of common sense, everyday sort of examples that I guess lend support to this. I mean, suppose that I have a fair coin. I flip the coin without showing you how it has landed. And then I ask, has the coin landed heads or tails? Well, it seems the reasonable response here is just to suspend judgment. I know that the coin has an equal chance of landing either way. I have no evidence about how it's landed. That just seems equivalent to saying, I don't know which way it has landed. I mean, of course, I could take a guess, and I mean, usually when people flip coins, they want you to take a guess, right? The point is to guess. The point is that you actually don't have any idea. You're suspending judgment, and you just have to take a shot in the dark. So the assumption then is that beliefs ought not to outstrip the available evidence. But it's worth bearing in mind that there are alternative approaches to epistemology. So William James famously argues in his article Will to Believe that there are situations where it can be rational to believe in the absence of evidence. So James notes that sometimes we face choices between hypotheses that are, in his words, live, forced, and momentous. So to describe that in a bit more detail, so a live hypothesis is one that strikes us as being a genuine possibility, where we're inclined to say that, for all we know, it could well turn out to be true. We take the hypothesis seriously, it moves us in some way, the evidence doesn't tell for or against it. So, if you have two hypotheses that are live, then you recognize that both of those hypotheses might, for all you know, be true. Then we would say that a decision is forced when there is no possibility of not deciding. So if I say to you, choose between leaving the house with your umbrella or leaving the house without it, that's not forced, because you could just choose not to leave the house. You have managed to avoid making a choice about whether to leave with the umbrella or leave without it. But now suppose I ask you whether or not you believe in God. Well, provided you understand the concept of God, you kind of have to make a choice here. Either you believe in God or you don't believe in God. There's no third option. Notice that not believing in God covers both the denial that God exists and agnosticism about whether God exists. So the thought is, well, you either have that belief or you don't have it. There's no third path. Finally, a decision is momentous when it matters greatly to you, when it has a significant impact on your life and the lives of others, when it has irreversible consequences. James gives the example of being given the opportunity to join an expedition to the North Pole. That will have enormous consequences for your life. And similarly, some beliefs can be momentous. Again, consider belief in God. If the theist is right, there's the promise of great rewards in the afterlife. If the atheist is right, then theists are just wasting their one shot at life on a futile cause, So that's a momentous belief. Now, on James's view, when we face a forced choice between two hypotheses that are both live and momentous, it's perfectly rational to believe one of the hypotheses despite the lack of evidence. James was aiming to show the rationality of religious faith in God, but we might apply his idea in the moral domain. So we might say, well, look, given underdetermination, there are going to be various moral theories that are live. The evidence does not decide in favour of any particular theory. At the same time, we are forced to choose one option or another, and we're forced to choose because moral theories guide how we act in our lives. They guide how we act towards other people. They guide our judgments of right and wrong. And that's just not something we can do without. We inevitably, we interact with other people all the time, and so we need some sort of framework for guiding that, and that's what moral theories give us. And then, of course, given the central role that morality plays in our lives, the choice is momentous. It matters whether we adopt the correct moral theory, and the consequences will often be irreversible. So think about whether you pull the lever in the trolley case or refrain from doing so that has significant consequences. So, on the Jamesian view, perfectly rational to believe one of two moral theories that are equally believable. Or is it? Well, let's grant James's claim that it is sometimes rational to believe in the absence of compelling evidence. Even given this, the moral anti-realist might object that this isn't really applicable to moral theories, because in the case of moral theories, we don't actually need to believe anything one way or the other. After all, you can be a moral anti-realist. Nothing prevents an anti-realist from endorsing a moral theory without believing it. There are pro-attitudes less than belief. I could endorse a moral theory in the sense of acting as if the theory were true, in the sense of taking it to be a useful fiction, or I could endorse it in the sense that I take it to express attitudes of approval and disapproval. There's a lot of options here. Now, since moral theories are supposed to guide action, it's going to be enough to just endorse the theory in some sense. Full belief in the truth of the theory will just be, inert relative to that. So it doesn't make any practical difference in the vast majority of contexts. Maybe in every practical context, it doesn't make any difference whether you fully believe that Kantianism is true or merely act as if Kantianism is true. So perhaps we are forced to choose which moral theory to follow, but arguably we're not forced to choose which moral theory to believe is true. Okay, let's turn to a final objection. We can ask, even if this underdetermination argument is successful, does it actually challenge moral realism? As we've seen, the moral underdetermination argument concedes a lot of ground to realism. It concedes that some moral propositions are true in virtue of stance-independent moral facts. It concedes that we can know some of these moral truths. We can know the basic deontic verdicts of our moral theories. For example, you ought not to torture children, or you ought not to pull the lever in trolley cases, or whatever. What the underdetermination argument targets is the deeper explanatory structure that gives us the reasons why certain actions are right or wrong. Now, the obvious problem with this, if this is presented as an argument against moral realism, is that moral realism is usually defined just as the view that some moral claims are true in virtue of stance-independent moral facts. That's all. If we can know that it's a fact that torturing children is wrong, well, that's enough to establish moral realism. Now, of course, moral realists may well be interested in exploring morality more deeply. They may be interested in explaining why it is that torturing children is wrong, but the success of that project is irrelevant to moral realism. So it seems that as an argument against moral realism, this underdetermination argument just misses the mark. I mean, it concedes everything that the realist needs. It just concedes that realism is correct. So how is this an object? How can this possibly be an objection to moral realism? Well, here's maybe one thought. Perhaps the underdetermination argument can be extended, or it can be used as a first step in a longer argument. So we might say, look, if the underdetermination argument is correct, then we cannot say why any given action is right or wrong. We cannot explain what makes any given action right or wrong. So the realist will have to say, I know what is right and wrong, but I have no idea what makes things right and wrong. Now, I mean, first of all, that is, I suppose in itself, that's rather puzzling. Like, we know that torturing children is wrong, but then if you ask, what is it for something to be wrong? Is it because it increases suffering? Is it because it fails to respect the dignity and autonomy of the individual? Is it something else? And you just have no idea. Well, I mean, that's a bit strange. And arguably, we sort of lose our grasp on what it is to say that something is wrong if we just can't. If you can't give any account of what it is that makes something right or wrong, then do we really have a clear grasp on what it is to say that something is wrong? But more importantly, although the primary moral theories accepted in contemporary philosophy arguably all converge, it's far less likely that we will see convergence with respect to some of the more esoteric theories. So consider the moral theory developed by someone like the Marquis de Sade, which takes it that imposing suffering on others is good. I have a video exploring Desart's moral philosophy if you're interested in the details there. Or think about the moral attitudes that prevailed in places like ancient Rome, which emphasized, very different values to what we emphasize today. So there are radically alternative moral systems. Now, now we might say, look, the underdetermination argument shows us that we can't say what makes an action right or wrong. But then if we can't say what makes an action right or wrong, we're going to have no way of responding to these alternative moral systems. Because what we'll just be left with are we'll just be left with these brute deontic verdicts that particular actions are right or wrong. These conflict with the brute deontic verdicts of other people, but there's nothing can be said to explain what grounds any given deontic verdict. So there's no way to show that our deontic verdicts are more likely to be right. So we might put the argument in this sort of way. This is just a sketch of how it might go. So premise one, different explanations about what makes actions right or wrong will lead to different deontic verdicts. So that is, suppose we're consequentialists and we say that an action is right if it maximizes the good. Then compare that to, say, a nationalist who says that an action is right if it follows the laws and conventions accepted within their nation. That will lead to different deontic verdicts, unless, of course, the nationalist just happens to live in a society of thoroughgoing consequentialists, which no society is. So, yeah, different explanations about what makes actions right or wrong will lead to different deontic verdicts. Premise two, we cannot judge between different explanations of what makes actions right or wrong. That's we might say that's what's shown by the underdetermination argument. Premise three, if we can't rule out an alternative explanation that leads to alternative deontic verdicts, this undermines our justification for believing our deontic verdicts. So we're not justified in believing our deontic verdicts. And with this addition, we have a more general skeptical conclusion that targets moral theory as a whole. It targets the deontic verdicts in addition to the deeper explanatory structure that gives us the reason behind those deontic verdicts. So maybe that's one way the anti-realist could argue. Okay, well, there you go. That's the moral underdetermination argument. I hope you found that interesting, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.